Welcome to the Numbers Don't Tell Stories show. Each week, we like to give our listeners ideas on how to evaluate numbers through story. Our desire is to entertain you and provide you with useful insight. Well, welcome everybody. I want to welcome you back to the next part in our series on data and its value to the business. Want to thank the NVSBC for the opportunity here to be part of their continuous learning endeavors. And like all parts of this series, what we're trying to do here is be useful and provide value for the members. And so today we're continuing that, and you see by the title of this series, it's Tell a Story. Well, what does telling a story have to do with data? Well, that's why we're here. And we're gonna try to provide some insight into the power of storytelling. Everything comes back to storytelling, and data is a necessary part of telling a story. And to that end, I thought that the best way to introduce and bring value in telling a story is to invite one of the best storytellers that I've come across. And he's with us here today, Matthew Dix. He's an actual teacher, a fifth grade teacher of over 25 years. He's an amazing author. He's got books on a variety of things, both fiction and nonfiction. His latest one is Stories Sell. So that's available. It's a great book about how to use stories to sell, obviously. And he happens to not only write about this stuff, but he actually practices his craft. He's a 10-time Moth Grand Slam champion. And that's no trivial thing. And he may have added to that in the time in between the time I last talked to him, but he's here with us today. Matthew, what a great pleasure it is to have you, to know you, and to have you as part of this. So welcome to this endeavor.
Thank you. You're very kind. I really appreciate the introduction. I can tell you I did not win last night, so the number stands at 10.
Okay.
I failed at my goal.
Well, it's sure to increase at some point here, so it's great to have you. So to the end of telling stories, Matthew, would you just level set us for a minute and give us the essence of what makes up a great story?
Sure. It's a great question because I think when I work with folks, the first struggle we always have is understanding what you're supposed to be doing. Oftentimes, people seem to believe that if something happens to you, or you have information to share or data to share, if you put it in some chronological order, that amounts to a story. So you go to work and some stuff happens at work, and then you come home and tell your spouse what has happened. You've now told your spouse a story, and that's just not the case. What you've done is reported on your life, which is really interesting to mothers and some spouses, but really no one else. So we want to avoid reporting on our lives, at least when we're trying to actually move people, get people to believe in us, purchase our product, believe in our idea, things like that. Ultimately, a story comes down to change. It's a moment where something fundamentally shifts in us or our business or, someone we know. I used to be one kind of person and then some stuff happened and now I'm a different kind of person. Or more commonly, I used to think one thing and then some stuff happened and now I think something different. It's that moment where we change in a way that will sort of resonate with our audiences in an equally meaningful way. And it truly is what happens when we watch a movie, when we read a book, if we're watching an excellent commercial, if we're watching a play. All of these stories, every story that is told, that is well told and really qualifies as a story, ultimately is about a moment of change. Even the dumb movies, even the most ridiculous movies in the world, they still have a protagonist who at the beginning of the movie lacks something or needs something or requires something, and then over the course of the dumb movie that requirement is fulfilled, or maybe it's not fulfilled, and that is also a story, someone pursuing a goal and failing to achieve it. So that's what we're looking to do, to create change over the course of time.
Man, What a great introduction to that concept. And every time I hear that, I think about like that, the essence of a great story, and to be able to, solidify that with one word, change. I think that's tremendously important. So let's actually make this real for our audience. Let's take something ripped from the social media world, and I'm gonna share this with everybody, and we'll take a look at, here's an actual social media post that's out there in the world, and that I grabbed earlier this year in July. And the idea here is, we've got Adam Schefter, well-known journalist and reporter on football, publishes a tweet. And so we know from previous sections of this process with data, our series on data, is that data is in essence a noun. It's a person, place, or a thing. And most tweets have that kind of stuff in there, and this one does that in very good form, but it doesn't tell us anything. So what Matthew just got through telling us was that, hey, something should evoke change. And so what we want to do is, we want to break down this post from Adam, and I'll give some perspective on this, and Matthew will give some perspective on this, and we'll try to construct what might be a story that we might derive from this. And when I initially saw this post, the thing that immediately came to mind is that it reads like a financial statement or a financial report, the typical TPO report, a quarterly readout or something. You've got a date up here at the top and a total, some line items, and then your quad chart. Well, Adam actually included 5 pictures, so he's an overachiever. But the idea here is that this reads very similarly. You've got big numbers, things that kind of stand out, but don't necessarily mean anything. And so we don't have any sense of perspective or how to read any of this. And so I immediately draw nothing from this. And in today's social media world, I might just scroll right past this. Hey, that's interesting, but what does it actually mean? And so, Matthew, great stories, we kind of have to start with some sort of end in mind, right? So part of this, I'm thinking, is that, hey, here's 5 rookies who all signed second contracts in the NFL, which in and of itself is a rarity. And they all did this in their, they were all, selected in the first or second round. And so maybe the big thing at the end, the thing that changes in my mind is that, hey, we've got, 5 people out of, the first and second round, all quarterbacks who signed their second contract. What are some of the things that start to come to mind for you when you start to see this?
The first thing I think of is what I started with, which is oftentimes people are reporting and not telling stories. I don't think
Exactly.
it's surprising that Adam Schefter is a reporter, and essentially he is reporting. He is
Right.
providing us with data, but no real story. Now, I know that there are times when Schefter is going to provide an opinion based upon the data, but what he's really done here is just allowed the readers of his tweet to draw their own conclusions. Or I think what you said was exactly right. I think more than likely people are going to scroll by this. I think that the odd assumption people make all the time is that people want to hear what we have to say. And I think the best storytellers in the world are the people who assume that no one wants to hear anything we have to say unless we give them a reason to actually pay attention and listen. And here Schefter really hasn't given us anything to pay attention to other than large numbers. But the
Right.
collection of large numbers are so similar that they cease to be large almost.
Right.
When all the numbers are about the same or similar, even the size of these numbers become irrelevant. So
Right.
Schefter might be trying to overwhelm us with large numbers, but when you overwhelm us with so many large numbers, they cease to have any kind of meaning. So, I think when we're looking at this as a football fan, as a New England Patriots fan who is suffering right now a little bit, I think one of the stories that we want to tell, or the ending that we want to aim at, is sort of the idea that, are these five football franchises like getting what they want from these quarterbacks, and are these good deals, and does this money make sense for each one of them? I think that's one of the stories I would be seeking to tell right away. What are you
Right.
thinking?
So I'm thinking the very same thing, but I'm thinking in a previous discussion I've had with you, you had a really great example, and I think this is part of what needs to be driven home about the importance of stories, is that we as human beings have this inability to deal with really large numbers. And in fact, something beyond 7 digits is really very difficult for us, which is why phone numbers are the size they are, 7 to 10 digits. And you had a great example that drives home just how irrelevant big numbers are to people and our ability to grasp them. I wondered if you'd share that question you had around, 18,000 seconds.
Oh, well, I have a bunch of them. 18,000 seconds is a good one. I often say 1,440 is a very deeply meaningful number for me, right? And so I start there. And when I ask people what 1,440 is, oftentimes no one can really tell me what the meaning of that number is. The people watching us right now, probably no one can actually identify that number. Um, Whereas I think you know what it is, right? You know what
Right.
that number
The
stands for?
number of the number of seconds in a day, right?
Right, that's the number of minutes in a day.
Minutes, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, and so then 86,400 is the number of seconds in a day, right? And so I often think 1440 is a really interesting number, because oftentimes we're thinking about time in terms of 24-hour increments. And when we do that, we limit ourselves to 24 sort of activities we can do in a day, when 1440 is a much more interesting number to pay attention to and sort of be able to utilize. But I love the idea of these large numbers. My favorite example on how to sort of contextualize large numbers. I don't know if I played this game with you before, Tom, but let's play it right now.
All
Do
right.
you know what a million seconds ago? Can you take a guess at what was happening a million seconds ago?
So if we know that 87,000 seconds are in a day, you start to take that, and how many days ago was a million, and so you're what, a 10 factor of that. So something like, 100 days ago is that roughly accurate?
It's actually 11 days. You went one
11.
standard
Oh,
deviation too
sorry.
far.
Yep.
Yeah, but no, that's good. So 11 days ago was a million seconds. Now, a billion seconds was 1993. So a billion seconds ago, Bill Clinton was the president of the United States in 1993. And so my favorite one then is a trillion, because our national budget comes out in the trillions. So take a guess at what was happening 1 trillion seconds ago.
So would we have been in the ice age or something like that?
You're the first person, Tom, in my life to get that correct. It was 36,000 years ago, which means human civilization had not yet begun. Humans were still hunter-gatherers wandering the planet. There was no actual town. We hadn't invented farming yet, and woolly
Right.
mammoths and saber-toothed tigers were still in existence. But I love that example because it really does tell a story about the size of the number. And my goal always
Right.
in that circumstance is to get people to attach the ice age to a trillion, to understand the size of that number, because I think it's an incomprehensible number. But when we do things like attaching imagery to a number, suddenly it becomes a little more relevant to us and we can understand the size and scope of it, like when we're looking at these numbers with these football players.
Yeah, that is the greatest thing to remember, and I'm glad that you did that, in played that game, because people watching this are going to see, oh, hey, you struggled with getting some of those things right. And imagine throwing up a financial report where you've got, millions of dollars or even hundreds of thousands, whatever the numbers are, or you're presenting your businesses to create a data visualization for somebody, you just saw in real time how we as human beings struggle to put those things in the appropriate context. So drawing the right analogy for people is immensely important. And another way that, in looking at this data that I saw as a way to try and help contextualize some of this stuff that most people don't understand, and maybe what Schefter was trying to get people to think about, is that 44% of rookies actually sign their second contracts with the team that originally drafted them. And that means nearly 60% of teams completely miss on their rookie drafts. And if you in business, if you had a 60% failure rate, I mean, you likely would be in big trouble, right? And so that's the kind of risk you're talking about in the world of, NFL and drafting and so on. I thought that was really interesting in trying to put this all in context when they, bet this kind of money on these folks, when you're thinking about, hey, relatively speaking, these people are, a quarterback is driving that franchise, and that you're going to get another 4 years out of them potentially after the first four. It's a good bet, which is why they're giving them these huge sums of money. And, when you look at the average NFL career only being 4 years, that also puts this in really good context and helps put things into a story. And that's, I think, part of what we're trying to get across to people. Instead of just reporting that out, we're really trying to get them to think in terms of, oh, hey, there's a lot more to this that we can get across if we start to put these additional layers to the story and get that out. And that's a very important art form if you're trying to convey and be successful in selling or conveying information in data visualizations and so on.
Yeah, and depending on what story you want to tell, it's so interesting. Like, it's just five simple salaries for five well-known football players. But, if you know a little bit about football, you know that Tua, from Miami suffers from concussions and is a
Right.
health risk, right? And it looks here like he's the least paid quarterback on the list
Hmm.
because maybe he has those health issues. But actually, if you do the math and you calculate the Joe Burrow 5 years versus the Tua 4 years,
Right.
he's actually making more money than a lot of the quarterbacks on the list, even though the numbers might mislead you in that way, which is a really interesting way that we have to make sure we're telling a story well. As Schefter puts this out, I would not be surprised if many football fans looked at this and said, "Oh, he's trying to show us that Tua is making the least amount because of his health concerns." When actually, if you do the calculations, Tua is actually making more money than some of the people on the list. He's just there for 4 years rather than five. So
Right.
looking to tell that end story again is really interesting. I mean, we could honestly just turn the world against these football players if we wanted to as well. If you wanted to argue that football players are making too much money, these numbers don't make sense to anybody. But if we say that, I think the numbers work out to be Joe Burrow is making about $150,000 a day for the next 5 years, including days off and when he's off season. That's
Right.
365 days a year. Every single day he makes $150,000. That's a number that might upset people a lot more than 275 million, because again, 275 million is completely out of context for most human beings. But to understand that that man's going to make $150,000 a day every single day for the next 5 years, that might be a number that would anger people. So if our end goal, again, thinking about what the story is going to be at the end, if our end goal is to say, listen, the NFL is a little crazy, we should not be paying these people that much, the 150 per year is a lot more meaningful to people than the 275 over the course of 5 years. So just looking at data and presenting it in the way that serves your story best can really change how people see these numbers.
Or you could put it in terms of the relative value of the teams, because we also know that, an NFL team on average is worth, between $5 and $6 billion, depending upon how you look at the valuations. And a quarterback, a lifetime quarterback can change the value of that franchise by more than their salary. And by changing, the viewership, the attendance at the stadium, how many times they appear on television. And so all of those things have to be factored into how you tell that story, because, a Joe Burrow playing for the Bengals versus playing for, the Patriots, who had that incredible, run, is a very different story. So you can place this in terms of that. And it's also, I think you drew a great analogy in one of our discussions, where if you looked at this as, if you were thinking about having surgery, and the price of a surgeon, you're looking at, a surgeon in Jordan Love, who plays for a very consistent team, versus, Joe Burrow, who's playing great for a team that is, that's run in a very mediocre way.
Right. Yeah. If you think of these franchises as hospitals, right? Do you want to go see the great surgeon in the terrible hospital, or do you want to see the average surgeon in the really reliable hospital? It really makes Jordan Love's salary here interesting because of all the players on the list, I think Joe Burrow, in terms of value to the organization, probably has the highest value to the organization
Right.
because his organization is typically a mess. I mean, they're the Cincinnati Bungles for a reason.
Right.
Whereas the Packers and Jordan Love, they almost don't need him because no matter what happens on that field, they're always going to be successful because they're the Green Bay Packers. And even part of that comes down to where they play and how there's nothing else going on, in that part of
Right.
the world. Like when you have the Packers and you're in that part of the world, it's critical that your football team is great and everyone loves them. So, it's almost as if the Packers have overinvested, at least in terms of the return on the investment, in terms of their value of their business, whereas Joe Burrow can really escalate the value of a football team. In the same way, I watched the Tom Brady turn my team from a miserable, awful football franchise that had no amenities in its stadium and was really a mess. And over the course of 20 years, it's become a premier team simply because of Tom Brady. So in that case, the salary really did turn over the company or the franchise in a meaningful way. So looking at the numbers that way can certainly tell a different story too. We could end our story with which player actually is going to return the greatest amount on the wealth of the franchise based upon the investment being made here. And that's an interesting story to tell as well.
Right. The greatest change agent, to you go back to the story, right, is who might be the greatest change agent, and how might you place that into the appropriate context for the value of the franchise. And there's a number of ways that, franchises are valued. And the impact of a star player is very difficult to manage, but at some point that has to be part of the story, because somebody like a Tom Brady never made close to these salary numbers, yet he's had this lifetime impact on the Patriots. And that's undeniable. And I think that's what's powerful about, seeing numbers and then being able to tell the story underneath it. And I think what we're trying to convey here with this, and this is a simple tweet or, social media post, but data is literally all around us, right? We're being bombarded by this. And in the case of this, it's a report versus having any meaningful impact on the end consumer. And I think what we're trying to get across is that stories are necessarily part of adding value to data. Data is an element of a story, and we should be thinking in terms of how do we take data and envelop that in a story and show the change that's come out of that, which is something that should be part of when we're doing a data visualization or a financial readout on a quarterly basis. What was that change? What is that thing that we're trying to get management or the new customer? What are we trying to get them to see as a result of looking at the data as we've presented it?
Yeah, and I'll say that telling the story, especially with data, is going to be critical because no one remembers numbers. Like numbers are easily forgotten and willfully forgotten. You don't remember the PowerPoint presentation that you saw 3 days ago, but you remember the movie you saw 30 years ago because our brains are wired for stories, right? Our ancient brains, which for almost all of human history, we were unable to convey information from one generation to the next through the written form. So our brains are pre-wired to understand and retain story. So even this conversation, this simple conversation about these numbers, have made them so much more memorable to people based upon the stories that we've proposed to tell and the many stories that you could tell from them, which is just an indication that presenting data absent a story is a guaranteed way to be forgotten very quickly. If we looked at these numbers in 5 minutes, most of the numbers would have fallen away from our minds. But if we think about things in terms of Joe Burrow returning the greatest investment, per dollar to the Cincinnati Bengals compared to Jordan Love, now we have a sense and a story behind it that starts to really resonate. So telling stories about data guarantees, or at least certainly helps us become more memorable. And I think that the best stories are the ones that are unforgettable and easily retold to other people.
Right. So as kind of a way of putting kind of a bow on this concept, I went ahead and took a second copy of this social media post and broke it down. And you can do this similarly as you're consuming various pieces of information, or you're a presenter of data through data visualizations as part of your company, or things you're doing for a customer. You're putting together some sort of presentation or things that have data in them. Remember not to fall into the trap of being the reporter. Don't just throw the year out here. Tell them why this year is important. This 2020 is important because in 4 years, those rookies are going to be up for their second contract. The big thing here with that 4 years is that, hey, 5 of these quarterbacks taken in the first and second round all got a second contract. That's probably memorable, right? That's a big deal. And this 1.25 billion is on here because human beings need a total. They need something to be drawn to, a something that's a shiny object.
Exactly. Yeah. It's exactly what I was going to say, a shiny object.
Right. Yeah. And then the line items are here because that's just what we do as humans. We've got to have some sort of Excel like set of data in a report format. And then we have to have pictures, right? Because again, we need some sort of graph to say, oh wow, that's really good, or whatever. And so we put these pictures, these action shots and so on to draw people's attention. But remember that none of this, as Matthew just said, is going to be memorable unless we give it the things that are necessary to generate the memories. And it's, as Matthew said, it's not going to be the numbers. No one will remember that Joe Burrow, bought, or that he got the 275 million, but they're probably going to remember that he bought the replica of the Batmobile. And that 275 million bought that Batmobile. It's like, oh yeah, I remember that now from that presentation. I just put this in context of a movie that everybody knows, or whatever the case may be. And so I think that's massively important, not to let yourself fall into this trap of recreating the TPO report, but to create a memory.
Yeah, I love that Batman example. I think the word that you used there was so critical, which is context. Numbers outside of context mean nothing. And once you start to think about all of the context that we can bring to even this simple set of numbers, you find a lot of stories to tell. We've been talking about the value of an NFL franchise, and you have to ask yourself, is the value increased by Super Bowl victories, or is it increased by playoff appearances, or is it increased by star players? I'm just looking at Tua here, and I remember before Tua, there was Dan Marino, who never won a Super Bowl. And so did Marino bring a lot of value to the Dolphins because for years he was an excellent player who didn't win a championship? And is that Tua's fate as well? Or like you brought up Tom Brady, who didn't make as much money but brought 6 Super Bowls to the Patriots. Are the Patriots valuable because of the Super Bowls, or are the Patriots valuable because of Tom Brady? One of the really interesting things would be for us to look at this list 10 years from now and
Right.
take a look at what has happened to them in terms of their championships and the value of their franchises as a result of the performance they've had. So I think all of this comes down to what you've described, which is context, and that is essentially going to be the story that we tell.
Yeah. And that's going to be the richness of this, in 10 years, as you noted, that you can go back and look at these franchises. And it just so happens that the Miami Dolphins were last sold in 2008, and they were sold for 1.1 billion. And so you'll be able to look at that and say, okay, well, did Tua's injuries cause him to be now sidelined, or is he able to take this franchise to the next level? Was Dan Marino the reason why the Dolphins, accelerated their value to over $1 billion by 2008? That was big news in 2008 when they sold for over $1 billion. That was a big number at the time. Again, no context for it, but it was just big relative to everything else. And I think that's massively important when you look at this. But I think it further outlines the reason why, like if you put together a financial report or you're putting out a data visualization, having the right form of history there so that people can say, oh, now this number relative to 10 years ago helps me put that story in the appropriate context, and I can now help people say, okay, hey, this is the direction we're moving, and it's positive, or we've hit road bumps or speed bumps, whatever it is, and there's things that help them put that number in context. So
Yeah.
that was really good.
And if we can attach emotion to our stories in any way, that's going to help as well. So, I
Right.
do think things like the Batmobile actually is a great way to emotionally attach, an audience to a story. Any Batman fan is going to suddenly think differently about Joe Burrow. So not only have
Right.
you landed an image, but you're giving us an emotion. So just thinking about these numbers, and I think $150,000 a day for 5 years is also an emotional attachment to that number for the average American who probably is not making $150,000. That probably is an emotional punch in the gut to a certain degree, unless you're a Joe Burrow fan and he's throwing footballs for your team, at which point you might emotionally feel good about it. So
Right.
we got to get people to feel something about the numbers, not only comprehend the numbers. They should walk away having a sense of what we want them to think about the numbers if we want to be people in control of the data we're presenting.
Right. And that really is the power of storytelling, is you exert some control around what people are taking away from this. Right? You're helping build a narrative for them, and what's imprinted on them, what's going to be taken away. And so all that imagery, and that's why I bring up, like the more you research about, in this case, the quad charts are human beings, so you can draw on richness there. But again, if you took this back to a business and said, oh, hey, I've got this chart, and it may talk about some manufacturing process. Well, you may take them into the manufacturing plant and give them something to remember about, here's how we're building this, or here's our, 30-ton press, and here's what it's doing, so that you create that image that you're controlling what they take away in that instant.
Yeah, it's the difference between being a storyteller and a reporter. I mean,
Yeah.
really, here, Schefter is not attempting to put his own spin or opinion on information. He's just literally putting out numbers and allowing football fans to take what they want from those numbers and sort of draw their own conclusions, which is fine if you're a reporter and you're just sort of playing it down the middle. But if you are using data in your business, you should not be playing it down the middle. You should be leveraging that data in an honest way to the best, results that you want from that data. So we absolutely have to be thinking about what is the audience feeling and thinking about what we're presenting at all times, and what do we want them to be feeling and thinking, and ideally those two things will align.
Yeah, and I think what you did right there, Matthew, was summarize the whole intent of this section in such a elegant way, is that if you're intending to use data in any meaningful way, you can't simply just be a reporter of it. Its
Right.
value is not in its sheer, written down or whatever. It's got to be somehow articulated or powerfully presented to make it memorable. And that I think is the usefulness that we hope people would draw from this section. And you summarized it so well right there. If people can just get this notion of, I'm a reporter here, and that's probably not good, and I'm a storyteller here. I've attached imagery, I've attached significance, I've created a memory. That's so important with data.
Yeah, and always keeping in mind, I think, your audience. I think quite often when people are storytelling or presenting, they're thinking about the story that they want to tell and not thinking about the way it's being received by an audience. And so before I ever even think about telling a story, the first thing I say is, who are we speaking to? Because the story should absolutely change depending on the audience who is receiving that message. And so we sort of have to sit in two seats at the same time. We have to be imagining what it is like to be an audience member with a certain set of predispositions, and then we have to also be the storyteller and figure out how to land a message with those predispositions. But I think oftentimes people forget the other side of the table. They sort of project without considering how that information might be landing. So the storyteller is always playing both of those roles simultaneously, so that we have control over the story that we want to tell,
Right.
and it's received properly.
That's so important when you're thinking about, hey, I'm pitching to a customer or I'm pitching to management. Who am I talking to? Because of the stories may differ, right? I may have some of the same imagery, but it may be slightly different. And so, that is such a great summarization. Matthew, again, I can't thank you enough for participating in this. You are just an amazing storyteller. I encourage everybody who's listened to this to go search out his stuff online and his books. What you're getting here is just a tiny fraction of his brilliance in this area. And again, I appreciate everybody following along, playing along with us here today. I hope this has been useful and can change your thought process around how you take data. And don't do data storytelling, just tell a story. Let the data help you along, but tell a story.
Yeah, absolutely. The data should be part of the story, but not the story. That's great, Tom.
Awesome. Matthew, thank you again. Take care. You've reached the end of the show. We ask that if you found this useful, that you please tell a friend. Leave us a 5-star review on the podcast platform of your choice. And if you're watching us via YouTube, please like and subscribe.